Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on increased revenue by securing our e-commerce platform. I am Nikhil Chahare, Director of Identity and Access Management within Edgile, based out of Boston. For today's webinar, I will be joined by Will Blay, Senior Program Manager, Customer Acquisition for Dynamics Fraud Protection from Microsoft, along with my Edgile colleagues, Frank Drews, Senior Architect, and Justin Willoughby, Senior Consultant. So let's take a look at today's agenda for the webinar. We will start with a quick introduction on Edgile, on who we are, and then begin the session speaking about the transformation of external identity management, talk through the transition from traditional to modern approach, and see what's unique about the Microsoft security model. And then we'll focus more on the modern approach and how the cloud security principles apply to a modern architecture. The next section on protecting revenue will be focused on Microsoft's dynamic 365 fraud protection capabilities, and we'll go into more details specifically around account protection function offered by DFP and how it can help save millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. Lastly, we'll cover Edgile's Quick Start program, talk through the objectives, and discuss how you can start modernizing your external identity program in a matter of few weeks using Microsoft's security and revenue protection solution, and end the webinar with the Q&A. Feel free to post your questions as we go through the content. We will address your questions towards the end of the webinar. So let's get started. So who we are. Edgile is a national consulting practice with 20 plus years of security experience. We predominantly work across 3 practice areas, and most of our workforce members are the Big Four alumni. Our first practice, the identity and access management, we do strategy, implementation, end-to-end transformation programs for all your identity needs. We are a top delivery partner with SalesPoint in this space. Our second practice, cloud security information. This is focused a lot on your cloud journey and how we can help accelerate adoption of top security and world-class solutions. We partner with Microsoft in this space and help with the strategy implementation of any of the Microsoft's enterprise mobility and security solutions. And lastly, our integrated risk management practice line focuses on the governance, risk, and compliance solutions. We are an elite ServiceNow partner in this space and help our clients build a modern risk management programs. Overall, strategy first approach, offering a full suite of consulting services. We specialize in highly regulated areas like retail, healthcare, financial services, energy. So kind of expanding across all different industries. So now let's begin the external identities management transformation journey with understanding what cloud security means. So what is cloud security? It is harnessing the power of cloud analytics for early detection and action against threat. It's how you implement technology, controls, policies, and services that protect your cloud data, applications, and infrastructure from threats. So keeping that in mind, traditionally, it's all about holding your external user identity and credentials on premise. Same user might have multiple accounts and credentials to support different digital services offered by the company. So if a user belongs to a partner firm and has access to your applications and services offered by your firm, there's no way to know if the user is still active unless there are some robust processes built around it. But difficult to automate. So it's a management burden to host these external accounts, credentials, and the support services and the risks that come along with it, especially from a security standpoint. There are repositories built over time, a different username, a different presentation layer, different user journeys for accessing resources and services offered by the company. It lacks consistent user experience across different service portals. And there is a need to build a more efficient process to support the revenue-making business. You might have an identity provider that's out of support or has security holes, very slow to adapt and enable new services. It's very difficult to modernize. So overall, this has financial and security impact and restricts you from modernizing your services. The intermediate approach in the middle of the slide, it's where we saw the dominance of the SaaS vendors, and they wanted to take advantage of the market scenario, and they started holding identities and providing capabilities like single sign-on to their third-party applications. The security model was focused more on the endpoint security by providing features like multi-factor authentication, but they have a limited view into how you could adapt to global situations and threat scenarios. And the AI is only as good as the data it can process. It lacks the visibility into where, how, and when the data is being accessed and what actions need to be taken on a particular transaction. So that takes me into the modern approach. So how does the modern approach differ from the traditional and the intermediate approach? Modern approach is about applying security principles to all identity, both internal and external. Here we are talking about true adaptive authentication, processing vast amounts of data. So you are able to do proofing, and it's not just your identity, but for the entire end-to-end user journey and user experience, right from the sign-up process to completing a transaction in the system and detecting any fraudulent activities. So modern approach gives you that flexibility of any use case to control what a user can access depending on different parameters, like who needs access, what are they trying to access, and from where, and make an informed decision whether or not to allow the transaction to be completed. It's about processing different signals that I spoke about earlier and allow for fine-grained security controls. So the modern approach to external identity management, kind of dwelling more into that, primarily consists of three components: platform security, revenue protection, and world-class user experience. So the remainder of the webinar is going to focus into more details on these three components and go into more details on this piece. But before we go into more details, I want to kind of show the magic quadrant by Gartner. With respect to the modern approach, most of the vendors are in the top right-hand corner that does this kind of work. So what makes Microsoft different? What sets it apart? And it goes back to the three components I mentioned on the previous slide. So with respect to platform security, it's a corporate commitment to securing identities. It's a corporate reputation from a multi-billion-dollar company like Microsoft. So the quality of the signal that Microsoft has and can process for security, threat, fraud detection is unmatched as compared to other firms. Even before a customer knows it's happening, these key signals can be monitored and required action can be taken proactively. Microsoft leadership in decentralized identity means that they're defining the next generation of the CIAM solutions, and their platform will natively support this. And then the beauty about all this entire service is that it comes for a fraction of a penny for each user. It's really costs nothing to kind of subscribe to these services. So this is the vast pool of kind of the signals I was talking about on the previous slide. The centerpiece of Microsoft's investment in intelligence is the Microsoft Intelligence Security Graph. So this is how they describe the way they synthesize vast amount of data from a huge variety of sources. So if you see on my screen, right from Azure, Outlook, OneDrive, Xbox, this telemetry helps understand the full spectrum of attacks and the sophisticated and various methods used by the attackers, which is difficult to match with any other security service provider in this space. So now to talk about the next section on cloud security and how it applies to external identity management, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Frank Drews. So Frank, over to you.
Great, thanks, Nikhil. Hello, I'm Frank Drews. I'm a senior architect with Edgile. I specialize in identity architecture and have been working in the identity field for about the last 2 decades. And I've recently been working on Microsoft B2B and B2C external identity projects. And these projects have solved some of the most complex business challenges in consumer identity that we've encountered so far. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the features provided with the Microsoft Azure B2C product suite and discuss what typical application architectures look like before and after a move to the cloud-hosted B2C identity platform. And I'll discuss some of the features of Azure B2C. So Nikhil covered this conceptually, but let's look at a typical architecture. Here's a typical approach which has all the components hosted in your environment, whether that's on-prem or maybe up in a cloud hosting provider, but with the identity components still being managed by you. Even if the infrastructure is cloud hosted and you own the identity platform, you're still responsible for things like procuring software and licensing, capacity management, patches, security fixes, upgrades. But in the identity as a service model, these are managed by the cloud provider. So you're always on the latest, most secure version of the platform, and capacity management is no longer your concern. It's much like an electric bill. You can consume as much as you need. So whether you're scaling up to meet unexpected successful demand or even expected seasonal demand, think Christmas shopping season, or downsizing or even sunsetting the capability, you only need to pay for what you use with no long-term commitments in hardware, software, or network capacity. So in the next slide, let's take a look at what this looks like once we move to a identity as a service using B2C architecture. And the first thing you notice is that the B2C identity infrastructure is separate from the authentication hosting. And because B2C uses modern authentication protocols such as OAuth, OIDC, and SAML, the authentication services don't have to be located with the applications. So you have the flexibility to move your application and data wherever it best suits you while the identity layer remains in the cloud. I've even had customers have applications that were completely internal to their enterprise and still use Azure B2C Cloud Identity. The next thing to notice is in the B2C box there, we've got a large number of services that are included in the platform. And remember that as Microsoft releases new capabilities and features, you get to use them right away, unlike on-prem systems, which require you to perform upgrades to enable those new features. And I put a selection of features. There's actually so many that in the short time we have, we can't go into real detail, but I do want to kind of indicate and point out a few highlights of some of the ones in the diagram. And as Nikhil mentioned first, and in my mind, most importantly, are the security features that are in the platform. And even non-IT public knows that cybersecurity breaches are on the rise, and they're a real danger to online services that everyone's relying on these days. So Microsoft, they've invested over $1 billion a year, billion with a B, towards building security into all of their technologies in Azure. And they operate a Microsoft Cyber Defense Operations Center, which is a 24/7 cybersecurity and defense capability with leading security experts, data scientists, et cetera, that protect, detect, and respond to threats to all of Microsoft's cloud properties. And so many of these security features, in fact, some of the most powerful ones, operate completely behind the scenes. Things such as identifying known exploited IP ranges and hosts and botnets, historical bad actors, and so on and so forth. And these are what I call globally aware security service that involves signals gathered all across the world, and something that no enterprise could hope to replicate on an on-prem system. And in addition to these keep you safe automatically features, as I like to call them, there are configurable services such as conditional access, which, like it sounds, allows access under certain conditions. And those conditions can be things like location, device, and other parameters to enforce rules such as blocking access, requiring multi-factor, etc. And speaking of multi-factor, Azure B2C has built-in multi-factor capabilities via SMS or authenticators. And I will talk a little more in this section. We talk about independent software vendors, how they've actually extended those. Next is kind of the bring your own identity. And this is a feature we often deploy. And that's the ability to allow users to bring their own identity, obviously, either corporate managed identities like an Office 365 tenant or other corporate owned federation tools like ADFS, Okta, Ping, etc. Or users can bring managed social identities from vendors such as Google, Yahoo, Facebook, etc. And these integration capabilities are pre-built for you, and all you need to do is select them and do minor configuration. Microsoft is also in the standards body of the next generation of authentication, which is decentralized identity, where your identity isn't owned by these corporations, but are completely with you in your own control. Definitely in the future, but Microsoft is leading that in a lot of the standards bodies. The next part is rich user interface. So most people that are traditionally managing identity are IT people. But in reality, the real customers for these services are often sales and marketing and product group teams Their interest in these identity items like signing in and other identity operations is really more about things like corporate branding and adhering to sometimes very strict visual guidelines. And through the ability to customize your screens using HTML, style sheets, and JavaScript, you can meet these very exacting UI requirements using the features of B2C. In addition, what we call user journey, which is the experience that the user has going through sign in or sign up, can have complex branching and conditional execution paths, letting you build really rich user sign up and sign in experiences. In addition to interacting with data that you'll be storing in B2C, you can also reach out to external on-prem or cloud sources to interact with data in line of business systems like customer loyalty or customer relationship management systems to allow you to include that data in your identity operations. One of the other boxes down here, I'm pointing out compliance frameworks. Azure actually has more compliance certifications than any of the other cloud identity providers. So B2C, as well as the other Microsoft offerings, are certified compliant with a pretty large collection of compliance frameworks. We won't list all of them. You can see those online, but we can think of ones that are global, like ISO 9001, some that are governmental, either US or other countries, such as FedRAMP or ITAR, and industry-specific certifications, such as HIPAA, FERPA, and PCI. Now, of course, it's important just because the platform is certified to meet these standards doesn't mean the complete solution is. That's up to you. But knowing that the underlying platform has already met these requirements makes it much easier to go from there. The other thing I pointed out in a box below are third-party integrations. So although Microsoft provides a lot of functionality in the B2C core platform, Microsoft has partnerships with currently about 17 independent software vendors that add value in areas doing things such as identity verification and proofing, advanced MFA methods, passwordless authentication methods, role-based, and as we're going to be hearing next, fraud protection. And so many of these products can even be purchased in the Azure Marketplace and built together with your other Azure services. The next slide, we'll take the things we talked about and essentially just put them in the form of kind of problem cases, use case statements, and it shows again like the plethora of services as you see over here on the right side of the screen, identifying the various product capabilities. Again, trying to go through all of these is something we don't have time for, but if you want to review these in the recording, or even better, contact us, we can show you how all these capabilities can be used in your solution. And it's kind of a last point on this section here. I'd like to mention that most customers have found that they can purchase these B2C services far cheaper than they can provision even basic services themselves. Pricing is based on not the number of users in the directory, but the number of active users in a particular calendar month. In addition, the first 50,000 users per month are included at no cost. And additional users are available at sub-pennies in various pricing tiers. And like with most products from Microsoft, a conversation with the licensing specialist will help you figure out the exact kind of cost of ownership for the B2C solution. Okay, great. On the next page, let's kind of circle back and review again, some of those really important security features that we get in the platform. And I put these in categories. The first one being credential attack mitigation. This is to make sure the intended users get in and the unintended users stay out. A real common problem with some identity systems are what we call nuisance lockouts. And that's where, unintended people ended up locking out intended people. Well, through some complex algorithms, we look at who's coming in and blocking only the ones who don't need to be in there while allowing the people who are legitimate to get access. Also circling back into conditional access again. So remember we talked about conditional access, it's things that you can define on what conditions people get access. But we also have an additional layer of these advanced kind of artificial intelligence-based risk detection algorithms that, like, again, work behind the scenes. You don't have to configure them. They're just always back there working and detecting some of these really complex situations. So that gets put together with your defined conditions and provides a much more advanced conditional access solution. The last one here is identity protection. And it encompasses a couple features, but one of the most useful ones is detection of compromised credentials on the dark web and forcing users to change their credentials if they match known compromised logins. So if a user's been sharing passwords, which is incredibly common, and it turns out that that particular password was compromised on another site, Microsoft will scan through your accounts and make sure that those compromised credentials aren't in use. If they are, we're going to make the user change the next time. Okay, next slide, we're going to talk about another aspect that's more operational than security, and this is health and performance monitoring. Azure B2C at scale is going to generate a lot of audit data. And Microsoft provides Azure Monitor, and that's a tool that's available across the Azure family. So it's not just something for B2C, but something you can use across multiple Microsoft products. So you can essentially leverage something you've learned with one product with another product. So by sticking on one platform, you get to kind of reuse the learnings and reuse the capabilities of these across multiple items. So really, this is all about gathering that data and actually turning it from just pure data into something actionable. As we kind of say on the right-hand side, we can analyze, visualize, alert, retrieve, and even export into other systems. So if you want to mine data such as, hey, what happened when I changed my registration, or what happened after I did this marketing campaign? Did I have more people register? Were they successful in registering? Where were they from? What time of day did they sign in? What did they do next? All those sort of things are things that you can kind of mine using the Azure Monitor tool. And next, talking a little more detail about one of the most powerful add-ins to the B2C consumer identity product is the Microsoft Dynamics Fraud Protection product. And I'm going to turn it over to Will Blay. He's a senior manager in the Microsoft Fraud Detection Protection team, and he's going to talk more in detail about that product and what it can do for you. Over to you, Will.
Sounds good, Frank. Thank you for that. And afternoon, everyone. As Frank mentioned, I work within the Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection organization. So for the next few minutes here, I'm going to take you all through a bit of an in-depth overview and an explanation of our account protection solution, which is one of the key features embedded within the product. But before we do that, I think it's really important to kind of take a step back and talk about, in the retail space today, what are some of the different journeys, or rather customer interaction points, that retailers are tasked with protecting as it pertains to their customers and your business itself? So when I think of this, I like to break it out into these three separate stages. So the first few boxes here on the left is where we have the account stage. And this is where you're preventing nefarious scenarios from occurring, such as fraudulent account creation to be repurposed for mule accounts, or maybe after the account's already been created, preventing fraudulent account takeover or account login based scenarios. And of course, in those scenarios, that's when a fraudster can either use the account essentially as a shell to eventually make a fraudulent purpose, or potentially just use the account to obtain the sensitive information inside that account and then use it elsewhere. So that's kind of the account stage in a nutshell. The second stage is that purchase stage. This is probably the traditional form of fraud most people are familiar with. These are those stolen credit card based scenarios. So I'm a customer, I click checkout or buy, I have the items in the cart, but I'm using stolen information at the time to complete the purchase. So that's the next point in which retailers are tasked with protecting. And then the third stage, and one that we're seeing pop up a lot more to those where it's relevant, is post-purchase fraud. And this is specific to brick and mortar retailers, where you're having scenarios such as omni-channel collusion, potentially people returning items without receipts, improper use of employee discount codes, and the alike. So there is that third stage of the customer journey as well, where once again, if you do have brick and mortar presence, there can be some fraud trends popping up here as well. So a little bit about the Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection solution. This is the actual tool that we as Microsoft used to protect our business lines. So you think of Azure, Xbox, LinkedIn, every dollar that flows through Microsoft is flowing through this tool we're going to talk about today. Bit of a history lesson as well, too. Historically, we had relied on a very rules-heavy approach. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, our executives came to us and said we need to up-level the technology and really switch to a more machine learning and AI-based model. So we did it. And since then, we've seen tremendous results, which we'll show in the next slide, for Microsoft as a user of this tool. hence why we wanted to come to market and commercialize it a few years back. But as you can see from some of these statistics here shown on the screen, one of the benefits and advantages we have with this fraud protection solution is that all the data that Microsoft as a merchant is sending through to the tool. So you think of, aside from our other numerous customers and partners utilizing the tool and feeding that data into the network, Microsoft itself gives us a great baseline of data to pull from and continuously improve the tool over time. And as I touched on, some of the actual tangible numbers that we've seen and the overall impact to Microsoft's business. So starting at the top here, kind of looking at the two in conjunction, looking at the false positive rates and how much those have dropped over the last few years. So of course, false positives here being the wrongful decline of valid customers. And on the other side, bank acceptance rates. So increased authorization rates with various issuers around the world. Combined over the last few years, we've seen about a 10 percentage point lift across the entire Microsoft book of business solely due to this fraud protection solution. So obviously, for a business of Microsoft's size, that's a substantial amount of revenue that's been generated from implementing this fraud protection solution. And then down at the bottom, more on the OpEx side. So looking at, first of all, our fraud loss rates and how much chargebacks have decreased over the last few years. As you can see, decreasing by about 70 basis points. And then over in the bottom right, one of my favorite things to touch on is manual reviews and how we as Microsoft today, across the board, utilizing this technology, only have a 0.3% manual review rate across all lines of the business. And for specific businesses like an Xbox, that runs on no manual reviews. So this tool has proven time and time again that it can billion-dollar businesses can run without the need to have any manual intervention, simply running off an approve or decline rule set. So really some fantastic results there for Microsoft as a merchant, utilizing the capabilities we're going to talk about embedded with this tool. So to give a kind of summary overview, and as I mentioned, we're going to focus after this slide a lot on our account protection specific solution, and that's on the left side relative to customer protection. Just two other pieces I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. That way the full picture is presented. So we have the account protection solution. Then in the middle, we have our purchase protection solution. And this is specific to those e-commerce scenarios. So as I touched on earlier, I'm a consumer, I'm checking out online. You as the retailer want to ensure that I am a legitimate customer, and B, you simultaneously want to ensure that you're not turning me away if I am a good customer. So this is where our purchase protection solution sits. And then also on the right side, we have our brick and mortar protection solution, and that's meant to prevent those in-store scenarios I touched on. So omni-channel collusion, improper use of employee discount codes, and the alike. So those two other capabilities, along with the account protection feature, wrap up the entire suite of services that are embedded within the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution. But as mentioned, we're going to spend the next few minutes diving into specifically our account protection solution and some of the benefits and features that are embedded within this tool. So as you can see here on the slide, the specific stage and scenarios this tool is meant to prevent is around fraudulent account creation, fraudulent account takeover, and account access. So when you're having new customers sign up, we want to be able to help you mitigate that friction as much as possible on the account creation side. But then simultaneously, as it pertains to reputational risk, we want to make sure that we're protecting those accounts and your business isn't being viewed as a haven for fraudsters to log in, get sensitive information out of these accounts because there's improper practices or tools being used today. So throughout the presentation, think of it as being through the lens of account creation and these account takeover based scenarios where the tool is really doing the heavy lifting. So specifically here as a schematic populates, just touching on the life cycle, if you will, of where the tool is sitting in the customer journey, and then how some of the features embedded with Azure AD B2C can help overlay some of our core capabilities within the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution. So I'm actually going to work right to left here. So if you start with point 1, our device fingerprinting solution. So this is where we'll be sitting on the account creation or account login page, and at that time, we're getting information on that consumer's device. We're going to talk a bit more about our device fingerprinting technology and what makes that up. But schematically here, customers creating an account or logging into an account, we're getting all of that metadata on the user's device, IP address, location, browser, device type, you name it. Hundreds of data points being fed into our solution to give us that good contextual knowledge on the device. And then point two is the account payload. So this is where potentially, if I'm a customer and I'm creating a new account, you might be asking for other information such as my name, email address, phone number, potentially a billing or shipping address. That information as well is also being fed into the fraud protection solution along with the device fingerprinting information to give us all the data we need to make a decision on whether to approve or decline this activity. And that's where point three comes into play. So I'm logging into my account, the solution's analyzing my device, some of the account payload information that's being requested, and then based off the different policies or risk tolerances that you as the user have in place, a risk assessment is sent back that says, yep, this looks good to go. You can approve this activity, or you know what, this looks really suspect or high risk. Let's decline this this login request just because it's not looking too good from our side. Now we think about some of the great features as well that Azure AD B2C comes into play, and where you can help overlay this with the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution. I'll use a classic example here around MFA. So kind of going back to the example I just gave, I'm logging into my account, and I like to think of it as operating like a stoplight. Either that's a green, which means great, this is low risk, let the user log in or create their account. It could be red. This is blatantly fraudulent, very suspect activity taking place. Do not allow this user to create or log into their account. Or it might be an amber yellow situation where, you know what, this account doesn't look exactly the most safe, but it's not exactly the most fraudulent. That's where using some additional features such as MFA can come into play. And then you as the retailer are ensuring that you're only increasing friction in that customer experience where appropriate for those scenarios where it is relevant, where there is some heightened level of risk being presented to yourselves as the business. So just an example there, but obviously given our integration with Azure AD B2C, a lot of great features and functionality that can be overlaid with the core capabilities of the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution. So just diving into a few of the features that make up the account protection solution. So first and foremost, as I touched on, it all starts with our adaptive AI technology. As mentioned, historically in the past, we did rely a bit on a rules-based system, but in the last 4 to 5 years, we've really switched this product to running solely on adaptive AI as a means to do the heavy lifting for us and for our customers. And the goal here being is not to take away rules, which we'll come on to, but essentially to make those rules and the management of those rules for these account stage scenarios really manageable and light for our end customers. The beauty of this AI, and once again, the beauty of Microsoft as a merchant utilizing this feature is that prior to commercializing it to the market, there was already such a substantial amount of data being fed into it that we were very confident that the AI can do its job and is proven inept time and time again. So that way our customers can have a very palatable set of rules to manage, but overall, let the AI do the heavy lifting here. And for context, how our scores work is we will issue a risk score or an AI score on every single transaction or activity. This runs on a 0 to 999 basis, 0 being the safest or lowest risk activity. And the higher you go up the scale, the higher the risk becomes with that transaction. So if someone was logging into an account and let's say the score or the tool returned a score of 850, that's obviously very high and indicating a very high probability of risk with this customer, with this activity they're initiating. The second piece is the fraud protection network, and I've somewhat indirectly touched on this so far, but this is where all users of the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution are mutually benefiting from this consortium network, if you will, of data. So obviously Microsoft as a merchant and our numerous other customers and partners all contributing to this network, of course, in a compliant and anonymized fashion. But you think about this fraud protection network, you think about all the data Microsoft is seeing. By the time a customer comes to your business to either create an account or log into their account, there's a very high chance that we've already seen some information before relative to that consumer. Maybe it's the device we've seen before, the email address, maybe the payment instrument being used. By utilizing this consortium style approach and having this network effect, if you will, it gives the tool all the means to make the most informed decisions as possible when a customer is creating or logging into an account. So that way, with the AI, we can know if we've seen this customer before, and historically, are they coordinated or correlated with good or bad activity. Third is device fingerprinting. So as I touched on a little bit a few slides ago, our device fingerprinting solution is a key part of what we're doing for account and purchase protection related scenarios. Now this comes standard out of the box with the tool, which is fantastic. Much like our approach with AI, historically with this tool, a few years back, we were using some of the more well-known providers in the device fingerprinting space, but ultimately for a business of our size, and the diversity of business lines we have, it simply wasn't scaling or meeting our standards. So, of course, given our experience in in devices, operating systems, browsers, and alike, we worked with some folks at Microsoft Research to develop our own inherent device fingerprinting solution, which has been a huge part of the success of the tool. And as mentioned, this allows us to get information at the time of activity, such as the customer's operating system, device type, IP address, location, and give us the opportunity to assign a unique device fingerprint to every single device we see across our network. That way, if we see that device again, we can know the history correlated with it and helps us compute the overall risk of the transaction or activity in question. As I touched on a little bit as well, our versatile decision or rules engine. So of course, we do not want the tool to run as a black box. We understand that users of the tool still need to institute some insider control over different types of account-based scenarios you're aiming to mitigate, or thresholds that you would like to set relative to your levels of risk that you're after. So or embedded within the tool as well, as shown a bit of a snippet here on the screen, is the overall decision engine or rules engine, as we call it, in which you as the user have control to set tolerances relative to the overall business and relative to some specific scenarios that you might have encountered in the past. Next is bot protection, which is a really interesting one to talk about. So as I mentioned on the adaptive AI piece, we assign a risk score to every single transaction or piece of activity. For account protection related scenarios, we are also going to assign a bot score to every piece of activity. The bot score, thankfully, runs on the same scale as the risk score, so that 0 to 999 basis. And essentially, the higher the score means the higher the probability that this activity originated from a bot. Now, you might be wondering, why would someone want bot traffic? Isn't all bot traffic bad? Why is this even a part of the tool? We've seen from our customers and from ourselves as a merchant that from time to time, there is a bit of an appetite to have a certain, modest amount of bot traffic be allowed to complete a sale or purchase. To give you an example, you think about the Xbox brand of business. The new Xboxes came out a few months back. They're obviously flying off the shelves. People can't get them fast enough. As a part of that, there is some bot traffic that originates online where they're combing the web, looking for the first place they can get their hands on an Xbox when they get restocked or come back in sale. So that type of activity doesn't necessarily constitute a negative or fraudster, just that it comes from a bot and that still might be legitimate traffic. So the bot protection capability is in here as well. So that way you can toggle that in conjunction with the risk score to decide, if we do want to take on a modest amount of bot traffic, we can set our thresholds appropriately. Or, of course, if you don't want any bot traffic whatsoever, you can also take the appropriate measures with this feature in the rules engine. And then lastly, the last thing to touch on here is custom events. And essentially, what custom events enables the tool to do is that we recognize that not all account structures are created equally. So you, for your business, might be gathering a very custom or bespoke piece of data or data points that are unique to your business. Essentially, the custom events feature allows you to send whatever data you would like in the account payload to DFP for scoring, and then we can take the appropriate action with that. So there really isn't any data point too weird or too abnormal out there. If you're gathering it and it's relative to your business, it can be sent to us and then used as part of the overall risk assessment on that account creation or account takeover based scenario. So with that wraps up my portion here on the account protection solution. Appreciate everyone listening and taking time out of their day. I will pass over to Justin to wrap things up. And Justin, over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Will. That was great. So hey everyone, my name is Justin Willoughby. I'm a senior consultant with Edgile, and I work in the Microsoft practice. So I specialize in strategic planning and implementation of Microsoft security tools. So to start my portion, I want to call back to a slide that Nikhil presented at the beginning of this presentation, and it talked about the 3 pillars of external identities modernization. And that was platform security, revenue protection, and world-class experience. So you heard about platform security from Frank and revenue protection from Will. I'm going to be touching on the world-class experience portion of things to kind of wrap us up. So when I think of world-class experience, I like to break it down into 2 more granular terms, and that's customer experience and user experience. Now, customer experience is all about the company's brand. What is a user's first impression? And then after doing business with that company for a while, how do they feel about that company? User experience is about the user journey, the flows, the interactions that user has, and how they feel about those. Now, why is this important? Well, people like to do business with companies they respect and they trust, and with applications from those companies that make things easy for them. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the security platform, the revenue protection behind this modernization effort. It's also important to call out that during this process, users are actually interacting with the applications that are in front of those platforms. So it's a good time to be thinking about the world-class experience aspect of things, the customer experience, the user experience, because it doesn't matter how secure the application is. If it has a poor customer experience or poor user experience, you're not going to get new customers, you're not going to maintain existing customers, and you're not going to overall grow your business. So it's definitely important to keep those things in mind during your external identities modernization journey. Okay, so now that we've talked about those 3 pillars, hopefully we've inspired you. But maybe you're a little overwhelmed trying to think about how to get your company from point A to point B, from where we are today to where we need to be. Okay, well, we can help you out there. Edgile has actually put together a quick start program for external identities modernization. And in here, we actually utilize those pillars that we talked about. So we leverage Azure Active Directory, B2B and B2C as our identity as a service platform. And that's the platform security portion of things. So it benefits from all the security that's behind Azure Active Directory and the billions of dollars that Microsoft spends on its platform and its security every year. Okay, and also we talk about Dynamics fraud protection in this quick start program and how it can help you in terms of revenue protection and account protection, like Will demonstrated earlier, and how it actually integrates with this platform. And then lastly, we bring in our world-class CX UX team that we've been putting together over the last several years with people from industry who have been there, built up brands, and drafted out these world-class customer experiences. And they're going to look at your app portfolio and try and guide you in the right direction. So what does this program look like in practice? Well, if you go to the next slide, I can kind of dive into that a little bit deeper. So this program, this External Identities Modernization Quick Start, is a 6-week program, and it's part strategy and part proof of value. So the strategy portion is we bring in those experts in security, in customer experience, in user experience, and we do current state analysis. Try and figure out the lay of the land. What is your architecture? Let's look at your app portfolio, that kind of stuff. Okay, and then we're going to listen to your ambitions. What are your goals? Okay, and how do those align? All right, and then we're going to take that current state analysis, those ambitions, and then our industry experience over the last couple of decades, and we're going to put together a future state roadmap for you so that you do know how to get from point A to point B. Okay, and not only will you have that future state roadmap after this engagement, but you'll have that proof of value. And what I mean by proof of value is we're actually going to stand up stuff in your environment. The B2C tool, utilizing B2C, B2B, Azure Active Directory, and all the security capabilities behind it. We're going to set up basic user flows like sign up, sign in, profile edit, password reset, and then show you some of those more advanced capabilities as well, like MFA, like SSO to your applications, okay, like the integration with DFP, like REST API calls to validate some user data perhaps. Okay, and then we're also going to show you how to utilize a modern process for managing that environment and that configuration and that code, and then how to deploy changes to that environment in a modern process, utilizing a code repository for your code and configuration, and then CI/CD pipelines to deploy changes to that configuration. Okay, so at the end of this process, you'll have that future state roadmap, but you'll also have that value that we've generated in your environment, so that you're not starting on step 1 of that roadmap, you're starting on step 2. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today, and I hope we get to speak with you. That's my time today, so I'm going to end it there. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll answer them. I'll turn it back to Nikhil. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. So now we are into our last segment of the webinar, the Q&A. So I'm going to quickly see if we have any questions from the audience. Looks like we have a couple of them. So I'll quickly go through them since we have about 15 minutes left on the call. So the first one is probably more valid for Frank. So the question is, what's the difference between B2B and B2C? And where would I use each one? So Frank, you want to take that one?
Sure, Nikhil, I'll be glad to. So we focus a lot on B2C, which is really designed for consumer context, but Microsoft also has a business to business or B2B offering. And so and many times there's a lot of similar characteristics. So choosing the right one can be a little bit unclear at first, but I've got some good general guidelines. So B2B is really an extension of your Office 365 tenant, which will contain your workforce users, which are typically synchronized from your enterprise AD, and trusted people from other Office 365 tenants that you invite to collaborate with, especially in Microsoft first-party apps like Office 365 SharePoint and maybe some of your own enterprise apps. While B2C, on the other hand, is for the customers that consume your digital services. And these are more typically people inviting themselves through a self-service sign-up, or potentially even by invitation sent by you. And these users can have locally managed usernames and passwords, or even better, using that bring your own identity from things like social identity providers. And the apps that they sign into are typically your own custom apps and not apps like Office 365, which actually, it's important to understand, can't be wired directly into B2C. And so oftentimes we'll actually see customers implement both, which in addition to some other reasons of separation prevents access to business systems like Office 365 to your customers and suppliers. And we all probably remember a recent case where a contractor account was used inappropriately to access an actual internal system. So in a separated model, since customers only exist, and those customers only exist in B2C, you've made it impossible for them to get access, whether it's an accidentally assigned access or maybe a nefarious attempt to access them. And we also have cases where we have workforce people needing to access and do work in your customer-facing apps using tools like Federation allow employees in your Azure AD corporate environment to access applications in your Azure AD B2C environment by federating between the two of them. So that's a little bit of what I call my decision tree on deciding, hey, should I implement B2C, B2B, both? And if I do both, which apps are best to protect with which technology? So that's a little, that's what I kind of start out discussions with customers who ask that question. So unless there's any follow on to that question, we'll go into any other questions we have.
Thank you, Frank. There's one more, I think a couple of more. Well, I'll take the first one. I think this is more for Will. Does Microsoft have a POC for DFP? So Will, you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And the answer in the short term is yes, we do have a POC for DFP for account protection, purchase protection, and the like. This can run in a variety of ways. So there's essentially two ways someone could do a POC for DFP. The first is historical data method. So this is where you can send us historical transaction information, and then we can upload that into our tools and essentially come back to you really in only about a week or two. It's very quick, and show you the lift we would have had by only using one or two rules relative to chargebacks, false positives, and the alike. So that's the historical method. And then there is the option for a live POC. So this is where you can integrate the solution and we can have it run at no cost in the background and have live data and analysis being fed into you that shows you how the solution would be performing if it was being used in the live environment. So both of those are options on the table, and we'd love to express or explain those in more depth. So if there's interest, I think feel free to follow up with the Edgile folks after the webinar, and we can unpack that in greater detail. But yes, we absolutely can.
Thank you, Will. I think there's one more question. What are the different user migration strategies that you have implemented for your customers? So maybe this is something, Justin, you want to take this one?
Sure, absolutely. So in practice, I've seen 3 different migration strategies and we've implemented them. So the first one is kind of a behind the scenes migration strategy where you utilize your legacy identity provider and people just log in as normal, but you kind of put in a shim in between that process. And as people log in, we create records for them in B2C. So very low user abrasion because they're just logging in like normal. And then when the day comes when you want to switch over to a tool like B2C, it's very easy to make that switch, and then people can just log in with their regular credentials. So another type of pattern is instead of having people log in through their legacy identity provider, you just cut over to B2C on day 1. And you have no user records in there, but you do a just-in-time migration process where someone's going to log in with their old credentials into the B2C sign-in process, and then we're going to take those credentials and validate those credentials against the legacy system utilizing REST API call, and then the legacy system is going to return a yes or no, whether they're valid credentials or not. And if they are valid credentials, then we can just-in-time create the person in B2C. And a benefit of this process is that the person gets to log in with their old legacy credentials, but we can also collect additional details from this person. So we can put up another page after they've just-in-time created, and we can gather a new validated email address or a new password if you have different password criteria you want to enforce, or an MFA method perhaps. So that's one way to do that, and we've implemented that before at specific clients. And then another way is if you really don't care about the legacy data that's in your old IDP, you can just have everybody re-register. So it's a similar process to what we talked about before. You cut over to B2C day 1, and instead of validating credentials against the old legacy system, you just have everybody re-register. So they're going to click the register button, or you navigate them there directly, and then they fill in information like what's their validated email address, new password, MFA option, etc. So those are typically the 3 options that I see.
Thank you, Justin. And I think there was one more that I think I just responded directly to the resource there. So I think we have addressed all the questions we have for the webinar. Just quickly. So just the last slide. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, join our Edgile team for July 28th, covering our Azure Sentinel Managed Services offering. So for more information or to register for this upcoming webinar, you can visit edgile.com/webinars. So feel free to register for this webinar, and I know we have a few moments left. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, and thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and appreciate the panel today who joined me along with me to get this webinar to a successful launch. So appreciate all the help. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you everyone again.